The worn gray parka looked completely wrong, hanging between two sleek wool overcoats in the lobby of Hargrove and Vance Capital Management. It wasn't the kind of wrong that made people look twice out of curiosity. It was the kind that made them look once, decide something, and never look again. The parka belonged to a man named Warren Cole, 43 years old, widower, father of one 7-year-old girl named Bea, who had insisted that morning on wearing her purple rain boots, despite the fact that it was not raining and had not rained in 4 days. Warren had let her. Some battles aren't worth fighting before 7 a.m., and he had learned, in the 2 years since losing his wife Caroline, to save his energy for the ones that mattered. He had dropped Bea at school 20 minutes earlier. She had waved from the door without looking back. The way kids do when they're already mid-conversation with a friend, before their parent has even turned around. He had stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching the door close, then got back into his truck. The truck was unremarkable, a 2009 Ford F-150 in a faded shade that had once been forest green, and was now simply the color of something that had been through a lot. The back seat held a booster chair, a library book 3 weeks overdue, and a Ziploc bag of emergency crackers that Bea had declared were only for real emergencies. A category whose definition she updated regularly and without notice. The glove compartment held registration papers, a tire gauge, and a handwritten note in Caroline's handwriting, that Warren had never moved and never explained to anyone. He had parked on the street 2 blocks from the Hargrove and Vance Tower, because the underground lot required a visitor pass he hadn't thought to arrange in advance. It was 8:47 a.m., the meeting was at 9, he was early. That was one thing Warren had learned from years of independent consulting work. You show up early, and you let the room form around you, because walking into a room already in motion means you spend the first 10 minutes catching up, instead of contributing. He didn't know, walking through the glass doors with his laptop bag over one shoulder and a folded set of financial modeling documents under his arm, that someone had already noticed the truck. Diane Vance was 51 years old, and had built the asset management division of Hargrove and Vance, from a single floor of leased office space, into 7 floors of owned real estate, overlooking the financial district of downtown Toronto. She was not cruel, that distinction matters. She was, however, a person who had spent so long operating in environments where appearance signaled seriousness that she had stopped noticing she was making that equation at all. It had become invisible to her, the way accent becomes invisible to anyone who has spoken one language their whole life. She saw the truck from her window on the 14th floor, noticed it in the way you notice something that doesn't fit a pattern you've organized your life around. Worn, older, parked crooked. She called down to building security. She didn't ask who owned it. She didn't check the visitor log. She said the vehicle looked abandoned, and asked them to have it removed before the morning client arrival window. The call lasted 40 seconds. She had moved on to her next task before she hung up. Warren was on the elevator going up when the tow truck arrived. He didn't know that yet. He was reading the summary notes he'd prepared. 3 pages of condensed analysis on a pension fund restructuring problem that Hargrove and Vance had been wrestling with for 11 months. 3 external firms had been brought in. 2 had produced reports that were thorough, expensive, and ultimately unusable, because they'd modeled the wrong risk variables. 1 had simply stopped responding to emails after the second invoice. Warren had been referred through a contact at a credit union in Hamilton, who owed him a favor from a project 6 years ago. He had spent 4 weeks on this, mostly at his kitchen table after Bea was asleep, a cup of cold tea going untouched beside his laptop, while he worked until 1 or 2 in the morning. He wasn't nervous, exactly. He had done this kind of work for long enough to know the difference between a room full of people who were genuinely looking for a solution and a room full of people performing the search for one. He had been in both kinds. He knew which one this was going to be. The boardroom on the 14th floor was glass-walled and looked out over the lake. On a clear day in October, which this was, the water was that particular shade of steel blue that makes Toronto feel briefly like a different city than it usually is. There were 6 people already seated when Warren walked in. He recognized 2 of them from LinkedIn photographs he'd looked up the night before. The others were unfamiliar, a mix of senior directors and one external legal advisor. Hess, he guessed, based on the way she held her notepad differently than everyone else. Diane Vance entered 2 minutes after he sat down. She didn't acknowledge him specifically, which wasn't unusual. He was the consultant. She would assess him when the time came. The meeting began with the kind of structured formality that large firms use to avoid getting to the point too quickly. Summaries of previous quarter decisions, a recap of the restructuring problem's history. 2 people said things that were technically accurate but practically irrelevant, and Warren wrote nothing in his notebook during that portion because there was nothing to write. Then the room turned to him. He opened his folder. He didn't start with credentials or methodology. He started with the mistake. The modeling issue isn't in the allocation structure, he said. It's upstream. The liability duration assumptions being used are based on 2019 mortality tables. The fund's beneficiary profile has shifted enough over the past 4 years that you're looking at a 17-month gap between projected and actual payouts. That gap is where the exposure is sitting. He paused, looked at the room. Nobody had said that before. He could tell by the way 2 people exchanged a glance that had nothing performative in it. It was the involuntary kind. The kind people make when something clicks into place unexpectedly. He kept going. For the next 35 minutes, Warren walked through the problem with the unhurried precision of someone who understood every layer of it. He wasn't performing confidence. He didn't need to. The work was specific, the numbers were accurate, and the proposed solution was elegant, in the way that real solutions sometimes are. Not complicated, just correct. He outlined a phased recalibration model that could be implemented without triggering regulatory review. He had run the projections under 4 different market scenarios. He had anticipated 3 of the objections before they were raised. By the 20-minute mark, the legal advisor had stopped taking notes and was simply listening. By the 30-minute mark, Diane Vance's posture had changed. Not dramatically, just the small shift that happens when a person moves from evaluating to actually thinking. At 35 minutes, Warren closed his folder and said that he was available for questions, and that he'd need to leave by 11:30 to pick up his daughter from a school appointment. That was when a senior director named Alan asked whether Warren had a sense of timeline for beginning an engagement, should the firm decide to move forward. Warren said he could begin the following Monday. The room was ready to have that conversation. The kind of conversation that involves retention structures and exclusivity, and whether he was currently in discussion with competing firms. Warren answered those questions honestly. He was not currently engaged elsewhere on anything of this scale. He did have 2 smaller contracts running. Yes, he could manage the workload. It was Diane who asked the final question before they moved to logistics. What do you need from us in terms of access and resources to start? A desk with a monitor would help, Warren said. And I'll need to be able to reach your risk team directly rather than through scheduling. That's manageable, she said. And then Warren's phone buzzed. He glanced at it reflexively, the way parents do, the instinct that never fully turns off during work hours. It wasn't the school. It was a notification from a city towing app that tracked impound activity. Something he'd set up years ago after getting a ticket in a neighborhood with confusing permit rules. His truck had been flagged. He looked at the notification for a moment longer than he'd meant to. Everything okay? Someone asked. My truck's been towed, Warren said. He said it the way you say something when you're still processing it, not with drama, just with the flat tone of a person who has had to absorb unexpected inconvenience more times than they'd like to count. The room did not freeze dramatically, but it went quiet, and the quiet was specific. Diane Vance felt it before she understood it. A prickling awareness. She had called about a truck that morning, a worn, older vehicle parked nearby. She had not asked who owned it. Her assistant, who had been sitting off to the side with a tablet, met her eyes briefly. That brief glance confirmed what Diane was already assembling. What does your truck look like? She asked Warren. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. 2009 F-150, he said. Green, or was, more or less, silence. Alan, the senior director, looked at Diane with an expression that was not accusatory, but was not neutral either. Warren looked at her too, then. He was not a man given to reading situations dramatically. He was an analyst by nature and disposition. He was reading this one accurately. "I think," Diane said slowly, "that I may have made a significant error this morning." She said it in front of her entire board. She did not soften it, or frame it as a misunderstanding, or attribute it to a miscommunication. That mattered, and Warren registered it. She asked her assistant to contact security immediately. Then she looked back at Warren and said, "I am sorry. That was wrong of me, and I should have verified before I acted." It was the kind of apology that doesn't arrive with conditions attached. "No, I'm sorry you feel that." Construction, no deflection into process, just the admission, plainly delivered, with the discomfort fully visible. Warren was quiet for a moment. There was a version of this moment in which he said nothing, let the silence do its work, extracted some form of advantage from it. He was human enough to feel the pull of that. The past 2 years had included enough moments of being underestimated. At school, 2 meetings where the other parents sometimes seemed surprised he knew his daughter's teachers' names. At hardware stores, where staff would sometimes speak more slowly at him than seemed necessary. At a dinner party 18 months ago, where someone had expressed mild amazement that he cooked Bay's meals from scratch, rather than ordering in every night. That he had a reservoir of fatigue around it. But Warren had learned, more from watching Bea, than from any conscious philosophy, that the way you respond to a bad moment says more about your character than the moment itself. His daughter had fallen off her bike 3 weeks ago, and skinned both palms badly. She had cried for 60 seconds, then said, "Okay, I want to try the turn again." 7 years old. He had driven her back to the same stretch of path and watched her nail the turn on the second attempt. "It happens," Warren said. "Let's get it sorted." 2 members of the board made calls. The towing company was located. The truck was still in the impound yard on Eastern Avenue. It hadn't been processed yet, which meant retrieval was straightforward. Diane personally authorized the firm to cover all fees and arranged for a car service to take Warren to pick it up after the meeting concluded. The logistics of the rest of the morning moved with the efficiency of people who had just been reminded that consequences are real and proximate. Before Warren left, Alan pulled him aside near the elevator and said, quietly, that what he'd shown them today was exactly what they'd been looking for, and that they hoped the morning's incident wouldn't affect his decision. Warren said it wouldn't. He meant it. He had assessed the room before and after, and his read was that Diane's mistake had been real, and her apology had been real, and those 2 things together meant he could work with her. The car service took him to the impound yard. The truck was in the same condition it had always been. A little dusty from the lot. The library book was still in the back seat, the emergency crackers, the note in the glove compartment. He drove back through the city the long way, along the lakeshore, windows down despite the October cold, because sometimes you need the air. Bea was at school until 3. He had time. He stopped at a Vietnamese place on Queen Street that he and Caroline had liked years ago, before Bea was born. When they used to spend Saturdays wandering that stretch of the city with no particular plan. He ordered the pho. He ate it at a table by the window, and looked out at the street and felt, for the first time in a while, like something had shifted. Not in a large, cinematic way, just in the way that days sometimes surprise you. 3 weeks later, Warren signed a 14-month consulting contract with Hargrove and Vance. The terms were more than he'd expected, generous enough that he paid off the last of Caroline's medical expenses, and opened an resc for Bea the same afternoon. He called his sister in Winnipeg and told her, and she cried a little, which made him cry a little, and then they both pretended they hadn't. The truck needed brake work that month, and he had it done properly for the first time in 2 years instead of putting it off. He didn't replace it. A colleague asked him why not, now that he could easily afford something newer, and Warren thought about it for a moment before answering. "Bea knows this truck," he said. "She learned to fall asleep in this truck on long drives." That was the whole explanation. Diane Vance did something else too. Something Warren only learned about later through a mutual contact. She revised the firm's visitor and parking protocols, so that any vehicle on record in the day's visitor log was automatically flagged as a protected entry in the system, preventing any staff, including herself, from ordering its removal without cross-referencing the guest list first. She didn't announce the change or connect it publicly to what had happened. She just made it. Warren thought that was probably the most useful kind of apology there was. The kind that changes how you behave tomorrow, not just how you feel about yesterday. Bea asked him once, a few months later, why he was smiling on the drive to school. He'd been thinking about none of this, actually. He'd been thinking about whether he'd remembered to pack her fruit, which he had, but the question made him look at her in the rearview mirror, at her purple rain boots, propped on the edge of the booster seat. Because she insisted on wearing them even though it still wasn't raining, and he said, "Just a good day, bud." She accepted that with the easy confidence of a child who has never doubted that good days exist. He pulled up to the school. She waved from the door without looking back. He sat there for a second longer than necessary, watching the door close. Then he drove to work.